on to Al-Qaeda, there's a habit of lumping up Al-Qaeda with Iraq, there was, and now there is a habit of lumping up Al-Qaeda with the Taliban. To what extent is it fair to do that in the context of the Taliban? And is Al-Qaeda an existential threat to the U.S.?
I think Al-Qaeda does pose a threat to the United States. If it were to obtain a nuclear weapon, which is a distinct possibility, though it's highly unlikely, they would pose an existential threat to the United States. That's not the case with the Taliban. Again, they are a guerrilla jihadi group indigenous to this region. They don't have a mission to attack the United States. And in fact, I would argue that remaining in Afghanistan and prolonging our occupation will push these otherwise irrelevant guerrilla groups in camp with Al-Qaeda. So the longer we remain, the more likely it is that the United States will end up uniting these groups against our presence.
You have traveled to Pakistan recently. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, it was an interesting trip. I enjoyed it tremendously. The Pakistanis were so hospitable, very warm, very friendly. I was actually doing a project researching America's foreign policy, both during the War on Terror and the Cold War, of how the United States has assisted various military regimes to the detriment of civilian leaders within Pakistan. And I traveled to Karachi, Lahore, Rawalpindi, Islamabad, Ahmedabad, Peshawar, and talked to politicians, former ISI agent, military officials, people on the street, scholars, writers. I try to get a broad cross-section of opinion on what they see as the future of U.S. policy, but also the past, and get sort of picking their brains on what America did well and what it did wrong.
What did you take away from that in terms of Pakistan's major problems?
I think the biggest issue that I saw personally, and it's nothing that's not necessarily profound or anything, but the pervasive level of conspiracy theories that are believed. And that would, of course, hamper any effort that the United States tries to make in winning hearts and minds. Many Pakistanis I spoke to were very skeptical of America's involvement in the region. They considered it a hostile occupation of Afghanistan. They were deeply suspect of America's involvement with India and the tacit acceptance that the Americans were offering Indian involvement in Afghanistan. And so given the fears and the skepticism surrounding America's policies, that makes any Pakistani politician who espouses those policies a target of the insurgents' wrath. And I think we just need to understand that in Washington, that America's toxic image abroad actually limits and hinders our policies in these countries.
If you were President Zardari's advisor, I've been asking this question a bit, what would you ask him to do?
For the good of your country, resign.
And why would you ask him to resign?
He is widely considered a U.S. puppet. He's ineffective. He's very corrupt. He doesn't know how to manage his own cabinet. He does not have the support of the population. And I would encourage someone like him, at least, to begin thinking about the nation's best interests and not his own.
Many in the U.S. government and in academic circles here feel, regardless of how effective they think President Zardari is, that America must throw its weight behind the civilian government. How do you feel about that, putting into context what you just told us?
There's a tendency to look at the democratic process as a benefit and not the leaders who are within that democratic process itself. Zardari in particular, even though he sort of arose through what would appear to be a democratic process, he is the head of a dynastic political party that is inherently undemocratic. Number one. Number two, the pervasive levels of corruption within his own government and within the political process itself doesn't create an environment that's conducive to any sort of democratic ethos or principles. So even though people within Washington say we must support Zardari, there shouldn't be unwavering support or a blind allegiance to his power at the helm in Islamabad. I think there should be a deeper critique of how effective he is at governing, and also the appearance that he is considered a U.S. puppet. And does that detract from the very democratic principles that we want to espouse and want to bring to the world?
You, alluding to our earlier discussion about your trip to Pakistan, you traveled through the major metropolitan areas. What kind of impression did you get of his support in the various areas of Pakistan you visited?
Well, when I was there, it was when Musharraf was stepping down. This was about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And there wasn't a whole great deal of support for the PPP for what it was, more as just an alternative to the sort of mayhem that many had seen with the lawyers' movements and Musharraf cracking down on the media. So it wasn't so much that people wanted the PPP or wanted Nawaz Sharif. They just wanted an alternative. And I think the one thing that I got from many people is that the media and the politicians that I spoke to were more concerned about the political developments and the lawyers' movements and democracy. And the people on the street that I spoke to didn't really care too much about politics. They cared about the economy. They cared about foodstuffs rising in prices. They cared about electricity shortages. So even the discrepancy between what the more of the elite classes cared about versus the people on the street, there was a huge discrepancy there.
Did any of the people that you meet stand out in your mind as people who view Pakistan's problem through a realistic prism?
There were some people that I interviewed who were either supporters of the PPP or former supporters of the PPP, and they were fearful of where their party was moving. They were fearful about the cult of personality that was built around not just Bhutto, but also now with Zardari. So there were political people that I spoke to who had a stake in the future system that were very hesitant to support their own political party. So it kind of shows at least the fissures within not just Pakistan itself, but also within distinct political parties.
You also mentioned that you found there to be a wide assortment of conspiracy theories and theorists. To what extent do you believe that those conspiracy theories are feeding off of American foreign policy?
I think they are. I think a lot of the conspiracy theories are reinforced and exacerbated by both past and present U.S. policy. We must keep in mind, at least within Washington, that the United States has sponsored various insurgent movements from Afghanistan to Nicaragua. We've overthrown democratically elected leaders. We sponsored coups. And all of those things were purportedly or ostensibly for the spread of American interests. In hindsight, many of the things that we did were actually to the detriment of U.S. interests and have left entire regions of the world roiling in chaos for decades. Iran is a good example. South and Central America are great examples. Afghanistan's a great example. So moving forward, at least, closing that trust deficit between the United States and Pakistan will be difficult because it's symptomatic of a deeper problem with U.S. policy.